The wind hit minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit at 11 p.m. Not a forecast, not a warning, not a fact. And on this mountain, in this blizzard, that number was not the danger. The danger was what came with it. 60-mile-per-hour gusts that turned snow into a horizontal wall of white violence, stripping heat from every structure on the ridge, every cabin, every tent, every traditional shelter that brave, experienced men had built with their own hands. Every one of them was losing except this one. One man stood at the entrance of a steel-domed shelter, lantern in hand, watching the storm the way you watch a fire, present, calm, completely unafraid. Behind him, warm amber light, the soft crackle of a wood stove, a temperature inside that's at 65 degrees warmer than the air trying to kill everything outside. He was not lucky. He was not reckless. He had built something that physics itself could not defeat. And tonight, you're going to learn exactly what that was, exactly why it worked, and exactly how you can replicate it. Do not skip ahead. Every part of this matters. To understand what this man built, you have to understand what he refused to build. The log cabin is a default answer in survival culture. It is handsome. It is traditional. It is photographed on 1,000 homesteading channels with smoke rising from the chimney and frost on the windows. It is also, in a real sustained blizzard, a structural compromise in almost every direction. Wood moves. It contracts in cold. Gaps open. Not large gaps. You would not notice most of them with a flashlight. But a gap you cannot see is still a gap the wind can find. A single 1-millimeter crack in a timber wall can devastate the thermal performance of 6 inches of insulation on both sides of it. You spend the money on R value and surrender it silently through a seam you patched last spring and trusted since. Pitched roofs carry their own risk. Heavy, wet snow loads a 400-square-foot structure with over 2 tons of pressure during a serious event. The ridgeline carries the worst of it. Roof collapses in true winter conditions are not rare accidents. They are predictable outcomes on under-engineered structures. Men have died in them. Men who knew what they were doing, who built carefully, who trusted the shape, because the shape is what everyone uses. And then there is the problem of surface geometry. A flat wall offers the full face of its surface to a 45-mile-per-hour wind. Every square foot absorbs maximum force. Every joint, every seam, every window frame is being hammered directly. You cannot insulate your way out of that. It is physics working against the shape from the moment the wind starts. This man had studied enough cold weather structural failure to know the pattern. He chose a shape that broke it. The United States Navy had the same problem 80 years ago, just at a different scale. They needed shelters for hundreds of thousands of men stationed across the Pacific Theater, in Alaska, in Iceland, in every climate that could humble a soldier who was not prepared for it. The shelters had to be cheap, fast to build, durable in extreme conditions, and small enough to ship anywhere in the world in crates. What they designed was the Quonset hut, a half-cylinder of corrugated galvanized steel, pre-curved at the factory, assembled in panels that bolted together in sequence. 2 men with standard tools could complete a full structure in under 4 hours. The first military order was for 2,000 units. Over the course of the war, they manufactured more than 170,000. They used them as barracks, as hospitals, as aircraft hangars, as chapels. They built them in jungles. They built them on permafrost. They built them on Pacific coral atolls, where humidity attacks metal from every direction. The structures stood. Most of them are still standing. The reason is the arch itself. When snow accumulates on a curved dome, it does not pile, it slides. When wind strikes a half-cylinder, it does not slam. It curves around the surface and loses its destructive energy. When structural load is applied to an arch, it distributes radially toward the foundation rather than concentrating at a single point. The egg principle. You can squeeze an egg from both ends with surprising force before it breaks, because the curved shell carries load in every direction simultaneously. The Quonset is an egg you can live inside. After the war, the military sold thousands of surplus kits. Farmers used them as equipment sheds. Remote Alaskan villages used them as community halls. Research stations in Antarctica still use derivatives of the design today. The Quonset hut is not a curiosity. It is a solution that has already been proven across 8 decades and every climate on Earth. This man knew that. He sourced a kit. He had a site. And the blizzard season was coming fast. Most shelter builds fail before the first wall goes up. They fail at the foundation. And they fail because of a mistake that feels like the right choice. Pouring concrete. Concrete feels permanent. It feels professional. It feels like the kind of foundation a serious builder uses. In frost-free climates, it is. In high-altitude, cold-weather terrain with seasonal freeze-thaw cycles, it is a slow catastrophe. Frost heave is a process where soil moisture freezes, expands, and pushes upward with forces that can exceed 50,000 pounds per square foot. Frost heave does not care how thick your pad is. It will lift it. It will tilt it. It will crack the structure built on top of it, usually before the third winter. Men who poured concrete in year 1 are jacking corners and filling cracks in year 3, wondering what went wrong. He used a floating perimeter foundation, pressure-treated lumber beams on compacted gravel, size and space to distribute the load across the full base of the structure. No rigid connection to the soil. When the ground moves seasonally, the entire structure moves as a single unit. Nothing cracks. Nothing separates. The shelter rises and settles with the frost cycle and returns to level every spring. It has no failure mode. It costs a fraction of poured concrete, and it will outlast every rigid foundation on the mountain. Once the perimeter was set, the steel went up fast. The corrugated ribs bolted together panel by panel, each one clicking into alignment with a precision that required no measurement, no complex framing, no heavy equipment. It was assembly, not construction. The arch formed naturally as the panels came together. The dome rose in an afternoon. But bare steel is not a shelter. It is a radiator. It conducts heat almost without resistance. In negative temperatures, an uninsulated steel wall is not keeping cold out. It is pulling warmth in and passing it directly to the outside air. The shell was the skeleton. What came next was what would actually keep a man alive. The first layer was not insulation. It was prevention. Thermal breaks at every structural steel contact point. Rubber gaskets, spray foam packed into every joint before panels were fastened. The concept is simple and almost universally ignored by first-time cold-weather builders. Steel conducts heat. If a steel rib runs continuously from the cold exterior to the warm interior, it becomes a cold bridge, a direct highway for heat to travel from inside outside, bypassing all insulation. You can have 12 inches of foam on every surface and lose enormous amounts of heat through a dozen unbroken steel connection points. He cut every one of those paths before they became a problem. Then came the spray foam. Closed cell, not open cell. This distinction is not minor. Open cell foam is soft, inexpensive, and permeable to moisture vapor. In a cold climate, moisture inside insulation destroys R value and feeds mold that breaks down the structure over years. Closed cell foam is rigid, dense, and essentially waterproof at the molecular level. At 3 inches of coverage across the interior steel surface, it delivered approximately R20. It also bonded directly to the steel, sealing every microgap, every pinhole, every surface imperfection. It was not just insulation, it was a vapor seal. Over the cured spray foam, rigid foam board panels were fastened to the interior framing. Another 1.5 inches of coverage. Another R10. Total wall assembly now above R30. Roughly 4 times the thermal performance of a standard log wall, and without any of the air infiltration that systematically destroys timber construction in high wind events. The final layer was tongue-and-groove pine boards, hand-fitted across the interior. The pine adds thermal performance at the margin. More importantly, it changes the psychology of the space. A man sleeping inside bare spray foam and corrugated steel feels institutional, temporary, transient, like a refugee in a container. A man sleeping inside warm pine boards feels like he built something real. In a survival situation that lasts days, mental state is not a soft variable. It is a hard resource. He treated it accordingly. An R30 shell with no heat source is an efficient freezer. The insulation is half the equation. What burns inside the structure is the other half. And in a tightly sealed small space, the relationship between combustion and survival is more dangerous than most men account for. He used a small cast ironwood stove, deliberately small, in a well-insulated 200-square-foot Quonset. A large stove would superheat the interior within an hour and exhaust a night's worth of fuel before 2 a.m. The correct stove for a sealed small shelter runs slow, burns dense hardwood, and holds a steady interior temperature without demanding constant attention. At full overnight burn, his stove consumed 30 to 40% less firewood than the same unit would burn in a comparable log cabin. The insulation was not just keeping him warm. It was rationing his fuel automatically. In a multi-day storm event, that efficiency is a line between lasting out the blizzard and running out of wood with 2 days still ahead of you. Now the danger. Carbon monoxide has no smell. It has no color. It gives almost no warning before it incapacitates a sleeping man. In a sealed, airtight structure, a wood stove producing CO can reach lethal concentration levels in under an hour if ventilation is absent. This is not a theoretical risk. It is a primary cause of cold weather shelter deaths that do not involve structural failure. Men who build tight and insulate well and then forget to vent their structure have died warm and unsuspecting in their sleeping bags. He installed a passive ventilation system, a small intake vent near floor level on the windward wall, a small exhaust vent near the peak on the leeward side. Cold, dense air enters low. The stove heats it. It rises and exits at the top. No electricity, no moving parts, no failure modes. The vents are small enough to preserve thermal performance. They are large enough to maintain oxygen levels and carry combustion gases out before they accumulate. This is not an afterthought. It is a non-negotiable design feature of any sealed cold weather shelter. It was built in from day one. The oil lantern hanging near the entrance looks decorative. It is working. A single lamp at full burn produces several hundred BTUs of radiant heat per hour. In a 200-square-foot space at extreme negative temperatures, that is a meaningful supplement to the stove during the low-burn overnight phase. It runs on half a pint of lamp oil across a full 12-hour night. It costs nearly nothing. It earns its place in the thermal budget without being asked. By sunset, the blizzard was no longer a forecast. It was a presence. Wind at the ridge crossed 40 miles per hour before dark and kept climbing. Snow stopped falling vertically and began moving horizontally, a white curtain of ice crystals at chest height, driven hard enough to strip exposed skin in minutes. The temperature held at negative 38 degrees Fahrenheit through the night without rising. Outside, the Quonset dome shed snow from its crown continuously. The curved surface gave the wind nowhere to deposit a load. Each gust that struck the dome curved around it and moved on. The base accumulated some drifting, as physics required, but the structural surface above stayed clear. No load built at the ridgeline, because there was no ridgeline. The arch handled everything the storm threw at it, without registering the effort. Inside, the wood stove ran at a moderate overnight burn. The interior temperature held at 27 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough to require good sleeping gear, warm enough for uninterrupted rest. The digital thermometer on the wall never dropped below that number. The passive ventilation system cycled quietly, invisibly, keeping oxygen steady and CO at zero. The lantern burned through the night and asked for nothing. The man inside slept. 200 yards away, a traditional timber frame cabin showed visible stress on its ridgeline from snow accumulation before midnight. The owner was awake, managing the load with a roof rake from a ladder in the dark, in the wind, in the cold. He managed it. He was skilled and careful, and he managed it. But he was outside at 3 a.m. in a 60-mile-per-hour blizzard doing labor that his shelter demanded of him. The man in the Quonset was asleep. At dawn, the storm broke. The Quonset stood exactly as it had been built. No stress on the frame. No gaps in the insulation. No condensation on the interior walls. No ice formation at the ventilation ports. The structure had not merely survived the blizzard. It had ignored it. That is the difference between a shelter that resists the environment and one that makes the environment irrelevant. A surplus Quonset kit, the kind pulled from old military or agricultural inventory, can be sourced for as little as $800 to $1,500 if you are patient and willing to search. A new kit for a 16 by 32 foot structure runs between $4,000 and $7,000 depending on the supplier. The steel is the cheap part. The insulation is where the real budget lives. Closed cell spray foam is not inexpensive. Professional application across a 200 square foot interior runs between $1,500 and $3,000 depending on your region. Rigid foam board adds several hundred more. Tongue and groove pine interior is a couple thousand for materials and a weekend of skilled labor. A small cast iron stove costs between $300 and $800 new. Foundation materials for a floating perimeter run under $1,000. Add contingency for hardware, ventilation components, the wooden door frame, and incidentals. Total build between $6,000 and $12,000, depending on how much you source versus buy new and how much of the labor you perform yourself. Compare that to a comparable log cabin shell, no insulation, no stove, no interior finishing, which typically runs $15,000 to $30,000 in materials alone, with inferior thermal performance in the structure produces. You are spending less money to build something that performs better in the only conditions where performance actually matters. That is not a compromise. That is a correct decision made with accurate information. You may never face a negative 38-degree blizzard on a mountain ridge, but the principles this man applied are not extreme condition-only principles. They're the physics of heat retention applied correctly, and they work in every climate where keeping warm matters. Thermal breaks prevent cold bridging in any insulated structure. Closed cell foam outperforms open cell in any moisture-adjacent environment. Floating foundations outperform rigid slabs in any location with seasonal frost. Passive stack ventilation keeps sealed structures breathable without mechanical systems that can fail. Small efficient stoves outperform large ones in well-insulated spaces. A dome deflects structural loads that a flat or pitched roof must carry directly.